The snap of splintering cedar cracked through the autumn air like the sharp report of a rifle. The heavy leather boot of a local merchant kicked the delicate wooden frame of the weaving stall. The upright posts shattered instantly. Spools of carefully spun yarn, dyed in rich ochre and deep indigo, tumbled into the filthy, freezing mud of the main street. Nahimana fell hard to her knees upon the jagged gravel. She did not scream. She did not weep. She merely scrambled with frantic, trembling hands to gather the ruined threads of her livelihood, while the cruel, biting laughter of the townsfolk echoed all around her. The crowd believed they were merely driving away an unwanted widow. They thought they were enforcing the unwritten, unforgiving laws of their harsh valley, pushing a solitary native weaver back into the shadows, where they felt she rightfully belonged. But the truth of this cold afternoon was far more complicated than anyone in that muddy square could have ever imagined. Stay until the very end of this tale to witness how a shattered loom wove two deeply broken souls back together. Leave a comment sharing exactly where you are watching from, to see just how far a story of true resilience and quiet courage can travel. The wind howled through the narrow mountain valley, carrying the bitter, freezing promise of an early and brutal winter. Nahimana possessed a slender, petite figure, radiating a delicate and fragile beauty that seemed entirely out of place among the rough-hewn timber buildings of the frontier settlement. Her flowing dress, the soft muted color of dried sagebrush, was already soaked and heavily stained with the wet, dark earth. She pulled her thin, worn shawl tighter across her fragile shoulders, shivering violently against the dropping temperature. The townsfolk closed in around her tightly, forming an impenetrable wall of open hostility. They despised the quiet, unwavering dignity of the young widow. They fiercely resented the exquisite, breathtaking patterns she wove into her thick woolen blankets. Those intricate patterns spoke of winding rivers, towering ancient pines, and the long history of a proud people, serving as a silent, constant reminder of the ancestral claim her people held to the very soil beneath the boots of the settlers. To destroy her work was to destroy her lingering voice in the valley. A heavy, calloused hand reached out and violently grabbed the last remaining upright post of the weaving stall, tearing the wood straight from the frozen ground. The heavy canvas roof collapsed completely, burying the beautiful, vibrant textiles under the filth of the horse-trodden road. Nahimana immediately pulled her arms inward. She pressed a small, intricately carved wooden box tightly against her chest, curling her slender body entirely over it to protect the small object from the trampling boots of the angry merchants. This subtle motion, this desperate, absolute need to shield the strange box above her own physical safety, was a quiet habit born of a devastating and profound loss. She closed her sorrowful dark eyes and breathed slowly through the rising, suffocating panic. She adamantly refused to give the crowd the cruel satisfaction of her tears. She would preserve her honor, even as they destroyed her physical world. Then, the harsh laughter abruptly died. A massive, overwhelming shadow fell across the muddy street, stretching long and incredibly wide over the ruined blankets. The boisterous noise of the crowd vanished instantly. The silence that rapidly swept through the square was absolute, heavy, and immediate. Thaddeus stepped forward into the center of the circle. He was a veritable mountain of a man, possessing an extremely large and muscular build that utterly defied the natural limits of the average valley dwellers. A heavy, thick fur coat hung completely open over his massive, bulging chest, revealing a worn-out shirt made of coarse fabric that stretched dangerously tight across his incredibly broad shoulders. Wide-legged trousers, secured firmly by heavy leather suspenders, tucked neatly into scuffed, massive boots. His weathered, tanned complexion showcased the deep, permanent lines of a harsh, completely solitary life lived high above the timberline. A thick, dark beard and messy, shoulder-length hair framed remarkably sharp, deeply serious eyes. He did not raise his massive hands. He did not utter a single syllable. He simply stepped forward with deliberate purpose, placing his immense frame directly between the fragile, kneeling widow and the mob of angry merchants. The sheer physical presence of the giant radiated a quiet, terrifying, and explosive promise of violence. The merchant, who had viciously kicked the loom, took a sudden, stumbling step backward, the color draining entirely from his pale face. The cold air turned impossibly thick. No person dared to move. The freezing wind whistled eerily through the narrow gaps between the wooden buildings, loudly flapping the loose corners of the fallen canvas tent. The towering giant slowly scanned the crowd, staring them down with an unflinching gaze. His angular face remained an unreadable mask of carved, weathered stone. Thaddeus shifted his immense weight, slowly rolling his broad shoulders in a deliberate, fluid motion. He looked down at the chaotic mess of ruined yarn. He carefully lifted his heavy leather boot and placed his foot onto a small, clear patch of dirt, making absolutely certain not to trample a single vibrant strand of the spilled indigo thread. The silent command hanging in the freezing air was overwhelmingly clear. The crowd, suddenly profoundly ashamed and entirely terrified by the lethal stillness of the mountain man, began to scatter rapidly. They muttered, nervous, fragmented excuses into the cold autumn air, pulling their heavy coats tight against their bodies. They dispersed quickly, scattering like dry, brittle leaves caught in a violent downdraft. Within a few short moments, the busy market square was entirely empty, leaving only the giant, silent mountain man and the desperately clinging weaver. Nahimana remained frozen on the cold ground, the fragile beating of her heart hammering wildly against her delicate ribs. She had survived severe sickness. She had survived the agonizing loss of her beloved husband. And she had survived the cruel isolation forced upon her by the inhabitants of this hostile town. Yet, looking up at this immense, completely silent stranger, she felt an entirely different kind of overwhelming awe. He was a raw force of nature, untamed and deeply intimidating. However, she quickly realized his massive, imposing body currently served as a solid windbreak, perfectly shielding her shivering, fragile form from the biting, relentless autumn chill. The giant slowly sank down to rest on one knee. The downward movement was surprisingly graceful and controlled for a man of his astonishing, hulking size. He reached out slowly with a massive hand that was incredibly thick with heavy calluses, scarred permanently by severe frostbite and countless untold hardships of the high country. He did not try to touch her delicate skin. He did not offer any empty, meaningless words of pity or false comfort. Instead, his enormous, weathered fingers gently picked up a fractured, broken piece of the shattered cedar loom. He brushed the wet mud from the smooth wood with a surprisingly gentle, deliberate tenderness. He held the broken piece of wood out to her, his remarkably sharp eyes finally meeting her deeply sorrowful gaze. It was a profound acknowledgement of her delicate craft, an unspoken, powerful gesture of immense respect for the tragedy of her loss. Nahimana reached out cautiously with trembling, slender fingers, taking the smooth wood from his massive hand. Their skin did not make contact, but the heavy emotional weight of the silent exchange hung warmly in the freezing air. She slowly rose to her feet, clutching the broken cedar in one hand and securing the intricately carved wooden box fiercely against her ribcage with the other. Thaddeus stood up slowly, towering majestically over her petite, slender frame. He turned his heavy head toward the towering, jagged peaks in the far distance, where the first heavy snows of the brutal season were already gathering in thick white clouds, and then looked quietly back down at the fragile widow. He offered a single, exceptionally brief nod toward the steep, dangerous mountain trail leading out of the valley. He turned his broad back and began to walk away, his massive boots crunching rhythmically against the frozen, muddy gravel. Nahimana stood entirely alone in the center of the ruined square, the cold wind whipping her long dark hair around her delicate face. Why would this terrifying, completely solitary mountain man willingly risk the violent, unified wrath of the entire settlement to protect an unwanted stranger? And what heavy, deeply heartbreaking secret resided hidden inside the small wooden box she guarded with her very life? The choice was not a difficult one to make. Behind Nahimana lay the cruel, mocking faces of the valley merchants, the shattered, splintered remnants of her only livelihood, and the absolute certainty of a cold, slow death by starvation. Ahead of her walked a living mountain, a terrifying giant wrapped in thick fur, ascending the steep, treacherous trail into the hostile, unforgiving wilderness. The choice was merely between immediate destruction at the hands of the town, or the terrifying unknown of the high country. She tightened the thin, worn shawl across her delicate shoulders. She pressed the intricately carved wooden box firmly against her ribcage, guarding the mysterious artifact with the fierce, unyielding devotion of a mother protecting a newborn child. She stepped carefully over the fallen timber of the ruined weaving stall and began to follow the massive footprints left behind in the freezing mud. The ascent grew punishing almost immediately. The wide, muddy street of the valley floor transformed quickly into a narrow path of jagged scree and hardened, frozen earth. The delicate lungs of Nahimana burned fiercely with every shallow breath of the thinning, freezing air. The soft, stassed, flowing dress she wore clung heavily to her trembling, exhausted legs, the fabric weighed down severely by the thick filth of the settlement below. Yet, she did not falter. She did not cry out for rest. She focused her dark, sorrowful eyes entirely upon the massive, rhythmic strides of the solitary giant walking far ahead of her. The physical contrast between the two travelers was staggering. Where she stumbled against the loose stones, the giant moved with a terrifying, effortless grace. His massive boots crushed the frost-covered rocks with overwhelming, absolute authority. The crisp, sharp scent of crushed pine needles and approaching snow filled the silent, empty space between them. They did not exchange a single word. They remained deeply divided by a vast emotional distance. Two profoundly broken strangers bound only by the sudden, violent events of the cold afternoon. She remained guarded, entirely unsure of his true intentions, observing his terrifying strength with quiet, lingering curiosity. Despite the immense physical gap between them, a strange, silent rhythm developed upon the perilous trail. The massive mountain man never once looked back over his broad shoulder, yet he seemed entirely, acutely aware of the fragile, shivering presence trailing behind him. Whenever the exhausted footsteps of Nahimana began to drag against the loose gravel, the giant would seamlessly shorten his massive stride. He would pause near a heavy boulder, pretending to inspect the distant tree line, allowing her slender, aching legs precious moments to recover the lost distance. This was a profound, deeply observant kindness, utterly lacking in pity. When they reached a narrow, treacherous switchback exposed entirely to the brutal, biting updraft of the deep canyon, Thaddeus stopped completely. He planted his massive leather boots firmly upon the very edge of the steep cliff. He stood tall and perfectly still, resembling an ancient, immovable oak tree. He angled his incredibly broad, muscular body precisely, allowing his massive back to absorb the full, violent force of the freezing wind. He deliberately created a temporary, vital pocket of calm air for the slender widow to pass safely behind him without the risk of being blown over the jagged edge. Nahimana recognized the quiet, fiercely protective gesture immediately. A profound, silent gratitude bloomed softly within her weary, aching chest. As she walked safely through the massive, shielding shadow of the silent protector, the sharp edge of her fear began to dull. She possessed an unbreakable spirit, and she refused absolutely to become a helpless burden to a stranger. As she continued the grueling climb, she made a fierce, internal vow. She would seek honest, demanding labor within the home of the giant. She would offer the diligent, capable work of her hands in exchange for the absolute safety of his thick walls. She would sweep the heavy, accumulated dust from his rough floors. She would forage for bitter roots and wild herbs beneath the coming snow. She would spin new, strong yarn from raw wool and weave warm garments to replace the worn, coarse fabric of his frayed shirt. She would earn her sanctuary through sweat and quiet dedication. The dark, dense tree line finally broke open, revealing a secluded, hidden plateau situated entirely above the thick clouds of the valley. A sturdy, formidable cabin constructed of incredibly thick, rough-hewn logs sat nestled securely against the sheer, imposing rock face of the mountain peak. The structure appeared as solitary and unyielding as the man who built it. Thaddeus approached the heavy oak door and pushed the thick wood open with a single, effortless motion of his massive hand. He stepped inside the dark, freezing interior, and immediately moved straight toward the stone hearth. He did not remove his heavy fur coat. He did not seek comfort for his own exhausted muscles. He simply knelt before the cold, gray ashes and struck a heavy flint against steel. A bright, warm fire roared to life within seconds, casting a rich, golden, dancing glow across the sparse, lonely room. He stepped backward into the deep shadows of the corner, gesturing silently toward the blazing warmth with a thick, calloused hand, offering the hearth entirely to her. Nahimana stepped carefully across the heavy wooden threshold, feeling the immediate, profound heat of the roaring fire wrapping around her freezing, shivering form. The sweet nut, smoky aroma of burning cedar filled her senses, thawing the deep, lingering chill within her bones. She clutched the precious wooden box tightly against her beating heart, her dark, cautious eyes slowly scanning the quiet, solitary sanctuary. The cabin of the giant was utterly bare, completely devoid of any softness, decoration, or human comfort. It was the absolute, undeniable reflection of a man who had intentionally stripped all joy and attachment from his daily existence. Yet, as the dancing, golden light of the flames flickered upward, it illuminated a single, solitary object resting carefully upon the thick, polished timber of the stone mantel. It was not a hunting trophy. It was not a useful tool of survival. It was a small, heavily scorched, and meticulously folded square of intricately woven wool. The vibrant dyes were faded by time, and the edges were severely blackened by fire. But the distinct, ancient geometric pattern of a native weaver, remained undeniably visible upon the fabric. The breath of Nahimana caught sharply within her dry throat. Her slender fingers tightened instinctively around the wooden box in her arms. Why did this solitary, terrifying giant keep a ruined piece of native weaving displayed upon his mantle? And what profound, unspoken tragedy connected the silent, imposing mountain man to the burnt, forgotten threads resting upon the shelf? The pale, fragile light of dawn pierced the thick, frosted glass of the single cabin window, casting long, silvery beams across the rough timber floor. Nahimana sat perfectly still upon a small wooden stool near the hearth. She had survived the terrifying ascent. She had survived the bitter, freezing night. The massive Tegno, intimidating mountain man was already awake, moving silently through the shadowy corners of the room, with the quiet, deliberate grace of a solitary wolf. He did not ask her questions about the small, intricately carved wooden box she kept resting securely against her thigh. She did not dare to ask him about the burnt, mysterious fragment of weaving resting upon the stone mantle. The immense, heavy silence between them was an ocean, but the freezing water of their initial encounter had slowly begun to thaw. When a soul is violently stripped of everything, the simple act of rebuilding is not merely an effort of survival. It is a profound, beautiful act of absolute defiance. To assemble a new foundation from the shattered remnants of a broken life is to declare loudly that the human spirit refuses to remain broken. Nahimana understood this deep, quiet truth within her very bones. She refused to sit idle within the sanctuary of the giant. She stepped quietly out into the bitter, biting, morning air, standing upon the small wooden porch. The wind was a sharp blade against her delicate face, carrying the dense, heavy scent of pine needles and incoming snow. She gathered several straight, discarded branches of smooth white ash from the edge of the woodpile. She carried the heavy timber back inside, laying the wood carefully near the warm hearth. She intended to build a new, smaller loom. The homemaking skills of the widow were not merely domestic chores. They were the very threads of her sanity, the sacred tools of her quiet resilience. She knelt beside the hearth, attempting to strip the rough, stubborn bark from the wood using a small, dull stone she had found near the doorway. The sharp edges of the rough bark bit deeply into the soft, delicate skin of her slender hands. Small drops of crimson blood welled upon her knuckles. Yet she did not stop. She worked with a fierce, quiet determination, shaping the raw timber with the desperate strength of a woman attempting to carve out a place in an unforgiving world. Thaddeus stood near the heavy oak table, silently preparing his gear for the brutal winter ahead. He watched the relentless, painful struggle of the young widow from the corner of his sharp eye. He observed the bleeding knuckles. He noted the unwavering, stubborn tilt of her delicate chin. The giant did not utter a single sound. He simply walked toward the heavy wooden table, retrieved his own personal hunting knife, and crossed the room. The weapon was immense, forged of heavy, dark steel, bearing a handle of polished bone. He stopped beside her kneeling form. He gently placed the heavy knife and a smooth, gray whetstone upon the floorboards directly beside her wounded hands. He turned his broad back immediately, returning to his silent tasks. This was the first gentle warmth beat between them. A quiet, profound offering of better tools, an unspoken respect for the dignity of her labor. Nahimana paused. She looked at the heavy, beautiful blade. She reached out, wrapping her slender, bruised fingers around the polished bone handle. The weapon was perfectly balanced, with the sharp steel The stubborn bark fell away from the white ash wood in long, satisfying ribbons. A profound, silent gratitude swelled within her fragile chest. By the time the afternoon shadows began to stretch across the room, the sky outside turned a bruised, violent purple. The promised snowstorm finally broke over the jagged mountain peaks. The wind screamed ferociously against the thick log walls, driving a blinding sheet of white powder against the frosted window. They were completely trapped inside the desolate cabin, sealed away entirely from the cruel, judging eyes of the valley below. The roaring fire provided a brilliant, safe haven against the howling darkness outside. Thaddeus stepped over to the heavy iron pot, hanging above the deep, red coals. He ladled a thick, rich stew of wild venison and root vegetables into 2 heavy wooden bowls. He walked over to the hearth and gently placed 1 steaming bowl upon the floorboards beside the newly constructed, lap-sized wooden loom. He took his own bowl and sat heavily upon a wooden chair across the fire from her. They shared the warm, nourishing meal in complete, comfortable silence. The thick tension of their vastly different worlds began to dissipate, replaced by the quiet, steady rhythm of shared survival. With her body finally warm and her stomach full, Nahimana carefully unraveled a length of thick, coarse wool from an old, discarded blanket she had found in the corner. She strung the strong fibers vertically across the white ash frame, creating a tight, perfect warp. She retrieved a small, vibrant spool of indigo yarn from the deep pocket of her flowing dress, a single precious survivor from the shattered market stall. She began to weave. Her slender, scarred hands moved with astonishing, hypnotic speed. The delicate fingers danced across the tight strings, pulling the rich indigo thread under and over, pressing the fibers tightly together with a smooth, carved piece of cedar. Thaddeus remained seated in the shadows, his sharp eyes fixed entirely upon the rhythmic, beautiful motion of her hands. He understood the language of silent creation. He recognized the profound, healing peace found only in the steady work of calloused hands. The darkness of the cabin deepened as the blizzard raged outside. The firelight began to dim. Thaddeus stood up smoothly from his chair. He walked toward the woodpile, lifting a large, dry log of fragrant cedar. He approached the hearth to feed the dying flames, intending to give her better light for her intricate, delicate work. As the giant placed the heavy log into the fire, a sudden burst of brilliant, golden light illuminated the small wooden loom resting upon the lap of the widow. The eyes of Thaddeus dropped toward the woven fabric. The pattern emerging from the indigo thread was not a random design. It was a highly specific, complex geometric formation of jagged mountain peaks framing a winding, endless river. It was an ancient, sacred symbol of an isolated, forgotten tribe. The breath completely vanished from the massive chest of the mountain man. The color drained entirely from his weathered, tanned face. He froze completely. The heavy iron poker slipped instantly from his massive, calloused fingers, clattering loudly against the hard stone of the hearth. His dark eyes widened in absolute, undeniable shock. He stared at the emerging pattern as if he had just seen a ghost walk straight out of the roaring flames. What devastating, buried memory did this specific pattern hold for the silent giant? And how did the delicate hands of the fleeing widow know the exact shape of his deepest, most hidden pain? The heavy iron poker clattered loudly against the hard stone of the hearth. The delicate fingers of Nahimana froze instantly over the tight warp of the loom. She instinctively pulled the small, intricately carved wooden box significantly closer to her side. The heavy, Immense silence of the cabin thickened until the air felt difficult to breathe. The giant breathed heavily, the massive muscles of his broad chest rising and falling with sudden, erratic speed. He did not speak a single syllable. He simply bent down slowly. His massive, deeply calloused hand trembled slightly as he retrieved the fallen iron tool. He turned his broad back immediately, retreating swiftly into the deepest, impenetrable shadows of the far corner. The impenetrable wall of silence between them grew thick once more. But the fundamental nature of the silence had shifted entirely. It was no longer born of the emotional distance between two strangers. It was born of a shared, profound shock, a sudden realization that their vastly different worlds were mysteriously, undeniably connected. Over the following weeks, the brutal, unforgiving winter completely buried the mountain peak. The jagged, towering rocks disappeared entirely beneath a heavy, impenetrable blanket of blinding white snow. The secluded cabin was sealed off completely from the cruel, judging world of the valley settlement far below. Within the thick, rough-hewn log walls, a profound and deeply comforting rhythm established itself. The two broken souls learned to navigate the small, confined space without uttering a single spoken word. They began to speak entirely through the deliberate, careful language of working hands and quiet, respectful observation. The barren, desolate cabin slowly transformed. The sharp, freezing bite of the morning draft was constantly countered by the rich, earthy aroma of brewing pine needle tea and the rhythmic, steady clack of the wooden loom. Nahimana brought a profound sense of purpose to the empty room. She swept the heavy dust from the floorboards. She arranged the simple tools with meticulous care. She always kept the small wooden box resting securely upon the table directly beside her working hands, a subtle, recurring reminder of the heavy burden she carried. The mountain man observed her quiet strength. He recognized the immense, undeniable dignity in her precise movements. They developed a beautiful and unspoken cooperation. When Thaddeus noticed the fragile, delicate shoulders of the widow shivering slightly near the frosted glass of the single window, he did not draw any unnecessary attention to her physical discomfort. He simply waited patiently until she stepped away to stir the heavy iron pot over the fire. He lifted her heavy wooden chair with a single, effortless motion of his massive arm. He placed the seat significantly closer to the radiant, life-saving heat of the roaring hearth. This quiet gesture spoke louder than any spoken promise of protection. In return, Nahimana offered the dedicated, healing work of her slender hands. When the giant departed the cabin to clear the heavy, crushing snow from the rafferty, she noticed a jagged, severe tear in the coarse fabric of his spare working shirt. She threaded her small bone needle with strong, thick yarn. She closed the torn fabric with meticulous, beautiful hand, and completely flawless stitches. She left the mended garment neatly folded upon his simple, uncomfortable cot, offering a silent gratitude for his unwavering provision. The giant accepted the quiet kindness without outward fanfare. But the very next morning, he provided a profound answer. He returned from the frozen timberline, carrying a massive bundle of heavy firewood. Tucked carefully beneath his muscular arm was a perfectly straight, exceptionally smooth piece of rare river willow. He walked across the room and placed the beautiful wood gently beside her small feet. He offered a vastly superior tool for her growing loom, demonstrating a deep, observant respect for her sacred craft without demanding a single ounce of praise. Nahimana sat near the warm fire, watching the imposing, terrifying form of the mountain man as he carefully sharpened his heavy hunting knife. A profound, startling emotional reflection bloomed softly within her weary mind. For the first time since the agonizing, tragic passing of her beloved husband, she felt entirely, undeniably safe. The deep, gnawing terror of the valley had faded completely. This massive, dangerous giant, a man wholly capable of immense, breathtaking violence, demanded absolutely nothing from her fragile spirit. He simply existed as an unyielding, unbreakable shield between her delicate life and the cruel, freezing world outside. A profound trust, fragile as a new spring leaf but deeply rooted in genuine respect, began to grow within the frozen earth of her shattered heart. The delicate peace of their sanctuary was suddenly shattered when the sky darkened into a menacing, bruised gray long before the natural arrival of dusk. Thaddeus had departed the cabin hours before dawn, intending to track a large elk through the treacherous, deep drifts of the high ridge. As the afternoon waned, the wind began to howl fiercely against the thick log walls, vibrating the heavy timber with terrifying force. The temperature plummeted drastically. The daylight died completely, replaced by a blinding, swirling chaos of violent white snow. Nahimana paced the small floorboards anxiously. She stoked the fire until the flames roared violently up the stone chimney. She prepared clean cloth for bandages, her heart hammering wildly against her delicate ribs. The terrifying mountain held countless deadly secrets, and the absence of the giant left a massive, gaping void of profound fear within the small room. The heavy oak door finally shuddered under a massive, desperate impact. The door swung open forcefully, allowing a violent swirl of freezing snow to blast directly into the warm, safe room. Thaddeus stumbled awkwardly over the wooden threshold. His massive, seemingly invincible frame leaned heavily against the sturdy wooden doorframe. His breathing was ragged, shallow, and terrifyingly wet. A dark, horrifying stain of fresh crimson blood soaked entirely through the thick, heavy fur of his winter coat. The bright blood dripped steadily upon the pristine, clean floorboards, pooling quickly against the rough wood. Nahimana dropped her wooden spindle instantly. She rushed forward with wide, terrified dark eyes. She reached out with her delicate, trembling hands, desperately wanting to press the clean fabric firmly against the terrible, bleeding wound. The giant recoiled sharply from her gentle touch. He raised one massive, trembling hand, signaling her fiercely to stop her approach immediately. His sharp, dark eyes were deeply clouded with intense physical agony, yet they burned with a fierce, absolute, and undeniable command. He adamantly refused her vital help. He wrapped his massive left arm securely around his broad midsection, clutching the heavy fur coat tightly against his chest with desperate, failing strength. He was clearly shielding something completely hidden beneath the blood-soaked leather. He leaned his immense weight against the rough timber wall, sliding slowly toward the cold floor, gasping painfully for the thinning mountain air. What fragile, mysterious secret was the silent protector desperately hiding beneath his heavy winter coat? And why would he willingly risk bleeding to death upon the cabin floor rather than allow her delicate hands to discover the truth? The immense, overwhelming weight of the giant finally gave way entirely. Thaddeus slid heavily down the rough timber of the cabin wall, his massive body collapsing upon the hard floorboards with a dull, terrifying thud. The violent, this swirling chaos of the blizzard howled furiously through the open doorway, driving freezing white snow across the warm room. Nahimana did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. She rushed forward, throwing her entire delicate weight against the heavy oak door, forcing the thick timber shut against the screaming gale of the mountain. The sudden, profound silence of the sealed room was immediately broken by the ragged, wet breathing of the bleeding mountain man. The deep, paralyzing fear of the fragile widow vanished completely, replaced instantly by the fierce, unyielding instinct of a dedicated caretaker. She dropped to her knees beside his massive, slumping form. She reached out with trembling, slender hands, desperately attempting to pull the heavy, blood-soaked fur away from his broad chest. Thaddeus flinched violently. He raised one massive, heavily calloused hand, his thick fingers shaking uncontrollably. He attempted to physically push her delicate shoulder away. A stubborn, absolute refusal to allow any living soul to witness his profound physical weakness. His sharp, dark eyes were entirely clouded with intense, burning agony, yet they still flared with a desperate, deeply ingrained pride. He had survived the brutal, unforgiving wilderness entirely alone for countless years. To accept the vital help of another was to surrender the impenetrable, absolute armor he had built around his shattered soul. Nahimana did not retreat. She possessed a quiet, terrifying stubbornness that rivaled the unyielding stone of the jagged peaks. She met his desperate, commanding stare with profound, unwavering calm. She gently but firmly pushed his massive, trembling hand aside. She leaned her delicate face close to his weathered, sweating brow, her dark eyes radiating a fierce, undeniable promise of absolute safety. The silent giant stared into the profound depths of her sorrowful gaze. The thick, heavy wall of his emotional resistance finally shattered. His massive muscular arm dropped heavily to the bloody floorboards. He surrendered entirely to her gentle, capable mercy. She pulled the heavy leather coat open. The thick, coarse fabric of his winter shirt was completely ruined, torn to absolute shreds. Beneath the shredded cloth, a horrific, jagged laceration spanned the thick, powerful muscle of his right side. It was not the clean, precise entry of a hunter, but the savage, brutal tear of a wild animal, likely the desperate, razor-sharp claws of a starving mountain lion. The crimson blood flowed freely, staining the pristine white snow that had gathered upon his massive boots. Nahimana sprang into immediate, desperate action. She rushed toward the roaring stone hearth, lifting the heavy iron kettle over the hottest, brightest coals. She required boiling water, and she required it instantly. She moved gracefully and swiftly across the small, confined space of the cabin, retrieving a small, worn leather pouch from her meager, closely guarded belongings. Inside the simple pouch rested dried yarrow root, crushed willow bark, and wild mountain sage, the sacred, traditional healing herbs of her forgotten people. These were the profound, ancient secrets of survival, passed down through generations of quiet, resilient women. She returned to his massive side, carrying a wooden basin filled with the steaming, herbal water, and several clean strips of soft white linen. She knelt upon the blood-stained floorboards. She dipped a clean cloth into the hot, fragrant water. With meticulous, breathtaking gentleness, she began to clean the terrible, gaping wound. The giant flinched instinctively beneath the sudden, stinging heat of the water. A low, agonizing rumble vibrating deep within his massive chest. Nahimana paused instantly. She rested her delicate, slender hand softly against the thick, violently scarred skin of his broad shoulder. It was a profoundly intimate, deeply grounding gesture. She waited patiently until the rigid, terrifying tension slowly drained from his immense, powerful muscles. This was the language of profound emotional safety, spoken entirely through the gentle, steady pressure of a calloused, working hand. As she bathed the torn flesh, her dark eyes swept across the vast, hardened expanse of his muscular chest. The skin of the mountain man was a permanent, devastating map of a deeply violent past. There were the faded, jagged lines of old knife wounds, the terrible, circular burns of ancient conflicts, and the devastating, heavy marks of untold hardships. Yet, beneath this terrifying, indestructible exterior, the flesh of the giant was burning with a sudden, dangerous, and rapidly spreading fever. The infection of the wild claw had already set deeply into his blood. He was no longer the invincible, terrifying protector of the valley. He was merely a broken, highly vulnerable man, relying completely upon the healing knowledge of the fragile weaver. The wound required immediate closing. Nahimana walked over to her small wooden loom. She retrieved her small bone needle and a long, incredibly strong strand of pure silk thread, the very same thread she utilized to bind the absolute strongest edges of her woven blankets. She returned to the bleeding giant. She sewed the torn, ruined flesh of the mountain man with the exact same meticulous, beautiful, and flawless precision she applied to her sacred craft. She covered the closed wound with a thick paste of the crushed yarrow root to draw out the dangerous poison, and she wrapped his massive torso tightly with the clean strips of white linen. The brutal physical exertion of moving his massive frame onto the simple, narrow cot left her entirely exhausted. Her delicate muscles ached fiercely, and her soft flowing dress was permanently stained with the dark blood of her savior. Yet, she did not seek rest for herself. She pulled a heavy, thick woolen blanket over his shivering, massive body, tucking the warm edges securely around his broad shoulders. The brutal night stretched onward into a terrifying, endless darkness. The violent blizzard raged relentlessly against the frosted glass of the cabin window. Nahimana sat faithfully upon the small wooden stool beside the heavy cot, constantly dipping a clean, cool cloth into the fresh snow water. She bathed the burning, feverish forehead of the giant for countless, agonizing hours. The profound, undeniable cooperation between them had transcended mere survival. It had become a sacred, desperate act of deep mutual reliance. As the absolute darkest, coldest hour of the frozen night approached, the heavy, labored breathing of the mountain man hitched violently. He tossed his massive, heavy head against the simple pillow, trapped completely within the terrifying, inescapable grip of a brutal fever dream. His massive Velnov, calloused hands clenched into tight, desperate fists, pulling fiercely at the heavy woolen blanket. A sudden, terrible sound escaped his dry, cracked lips. It was not a groan of physical agony, but a desperate, completely shattered plea from a deeply broken soul. He whispered a single, haunting name into the silent, shifting shadows of the desolate cabin. Elias. The heart of Nahimana skipped a heavy, terrified beat. She froze completely. The cool, damp cloth hovering uselessly in her trembling fingers. Who was this mysterious person the giant had so tragically failed to protect in his forgotten, buried past? And what terrible, suffocating guilt forced this living mountain to hide his face from the entire living world? The haunted whisper of the unknown name vanished entirely into the cold, shifting shadows of the desolate cabin, swallowed by the howling wind of the relentless blizzard. The fierce, burning fever of the giant finally broke upon the fourth dawn, surrendering completely to the relentless, dedicated care of the fragile widow. The impenetrable wall of pride belonging to the solitary mountain man had shattered completely during his profound vulnerability, leaving behind a delicate, unspoken bond forged in blood and boiling water. Weeks turned into a brutal, icy imprisonment upon the high ridge. The deep laceration across the muscular right side of the mountain man eventually closed into a thick, angry scar. However, as the harsh winter deepened, the heavy sacks of flour and salt resting against the log wall grew terrifyingly empty. The grim reality of their mutual survival demanded a highly dangerous descent into the hostile, unforgiving valley below. On the morning of their departure, the frozen air was brittle and blindingly clear. Before they stepped out into the freezing wind, Thaddeus paused near the heavy oak door. He reached out with his massive, deeply calloused hands and retrieved a pristine, extremely thick pelt of silver fox. He draped the beautiful, warm fur meticulously over the delicate shoulders of Nahimana, carefully adjusting the heavy hide to ensure the biting winter draft could not reach her fragile neck. This profound, silent gesture of immense care provided a deep, radiating warmth that completely outmatched the roaring fire of the stone hearth. The dangerous journey downward was a perilous navigation of slick ice and jagged stone. When the rough timber buildings of the valley settlement finally appeared through the distant pine trees, a heavy knot of dread formed tightly within the stomach of the widow. The sensory assault of the harsh town was immediate and utterly overwhelming. The bitter, suffocating stench of burning coal smoke burned the back of her throat, completely replacing the clean, sharp scent of mountain cedar. The muddy, frozen slush of the main street sucked heavily at their leather boots, threatening to drag them down into the filthy earth. The busy townsfolk ceased their daily labor the exact moment the massive mountain man and the slender weaver stepped cautiously into the open market square. The whispering began immediately, slithering through the cold air like venomous serpents. The cruel, unforgiving eyes of the wealthy merchants and the local women stared with open, unabashed hostility. They murmured vile, baseless rumors regarding the true nature of the solitary arrangement upon the isolated mountain peak. They viewed the quiet survival of the gentle widow as a scandalous, unforgivable offense against their rigid, deeply prejudiced society. Nahimana walked with her chin held high, refusing absolutely to reveal her deep, trembling fear to the hateful crowd. She clutched a thick, heavy woolen satchel tightly against her delicate rib cage. Deep inside the dark bag, her slender fingers constantly sought the familiar, comforting shape of the intricately carved wooden box, repeating the subtle, desperate habit of protecting her deeply hidden truth. Over her other arm, she carried a magnificent, newly finished blanket, a breathtaking tapestry of deep indigo and vibrant crimson thread, intended to secure their essential trade. As the venomous whispers grew louder and significantly bolder, a group of imposing local men stepped deliberately into the center of the muddy street, entirely blocking the path toward the general store. Thaddeus did not break his massive stride. He simply shifted his immense, heavily muscular frame, placing his incredibly broad body directly between the fragile widow and the hateful crowd. He became a living, impenetrable barricade of worn leather and terrifying silence. His sharp, dark eyes swept slowly across the hostile faces, delivering a lethal, absolute warning without uttering a single word. The aggressive men stepped backward instantly, completely terrified by the undeniable threat of overwhelming violence radiating from the silent protector. They reached the covered wooden porch of the trading post. The greedy merchant stepped outside, his deeply judgmental eyes dropping immediately to the stunning fabric draped casually across the arm of the widow. The sheer, undeniable perfection of the weaving forced a heavy, stunned silence upon the cruel man. The complex, the beautiful geometric patterns commanded absolute, immediate respect, validating the immense skill of her delicate hands before the very people who had once destroyed her fragile loom. The merchant handed over the heavy sacks of flour and salt without attempting a single insult, completely defeated by the undeniable mastery of her ancient, sacred craft, while Thaddeus loaded the heavy provisions securely onto the back of his sturdy pack mule. Nahimana stood quietly beside the large, patient animal. A profound, overwhelming emotional reflection washed completely over her weary spirit. She realized deeply that she no longer feared the cruel judgment of the valley. Her resilient heart belonged entirely to the quiet, protective sanctuary of the mountain cabin. Her deepening attachment to the silent, fiercely loyal giant terrified her, not because she feared his immense strength, but because she recognized the devastating reality that her continued presence might ultimately bring the violent, destructive wrath of the town upon his peaceful, solitary existence. As if hearing the anxious, rapid beating of her fragile heart, Thaddeus turned slowly away from the heavy saddlebags. He reached down and gently placed his massive, warm hand directly over her slender, trembling fingers resting upon the leather reins. He offered a single, deeply grounding squeeze, anchoring her terrified spirit firmly back into the present moment and silently promising that they would endure the hatred together. Do not think you can hide forever up in those clouds. A harsh, highly authoritative voice barked suddenly across the freezing air. The local sheriff, a man possessing cold, dead eyes and a heavy tin star pinned directly to his thick wool coat, stepped heavily onto the wooden porch. He did not look at the massive mountain man. He directed his severe, unforgiving gaze entirely upon the slender widow. The legal status of that mountain land does not belong to your kind. The sheriff sneered coldly, his right hand resting casually upon the heavy iron grip of his holstered revolver. The family of your late husband filed the proper paperwork this very morning. They officially claim you stole property that rightfully belongs exclusively to the bloodline of the deceased. You are trespassing upon a legal inheritance. Thaddeus stepped forward instantly, his massive chest rising with a terrifying, entirely silent fury. The arrogant sheriff raised his free hand quickly, taking a wide, nervous step backward toward the absolute safety of the gathering crowd. I am not looking for a bloody fight today. Mountain man, the lawman muttered darkly, his breath pluming white in the freezing afternoon air. But the law is the law. The eviction papers are signed entirely by the judge. We will ascend that ridge to remove her completely before the week is out. The sheriff turned his back and walked briskly away, leaving the heavy, terrifying threat hanging thick in the freezing winter air. Thaddeus stared up toward the jagged, snow-covered peaks, his jaw clenched tightly beneath his thick, dark beard. He had silently sworn to protect her beautiful life, but he could not physically fight the entire armed force of the established law without risking absolute destruction. Nahimana pressed the heavy satchel containing the mysterious and significantly tighter against her racing heart. Knowing the devastating truth hidden safely inside was their absolute only remaining hope. How many desperate, fleeting days did the broken mountain man and the resilient weaver truly have before the unforgiving law came violently knocking upon their sanctuary door? The heavy, iron door of the mountain cabin slammed shut against the biting wind of the high country. sealing the sanctuary from the gathering darkness outside. Nahimana moved straight toward the stone hearth, her slender hands carefully placing the heavy sacks of flour and salt upon the rough-hewn floorboards. The sudden, profound silence of the room was heavy and suffocating. The devastating paradigm shift had landed with the crushing weight of an avalanche. The eviction was no longer a distant, abstract threat. The legal papers were real, signed by the cruel hand of the valley judge, and carried by the cold, dead eyes of the local sheriff. Thaddeus walked over to the wooden table. He placed his massive hands flat upon the rough timber, leaning his immense, bulging physique forward. His sharp, dark eyes were entirely focused upon the center of the wood, his angular face carved in deep, troubled stone. He had spent his entire life believing the high timberline was a fortress impenetrable to the poison of the valley. He had assumed his massive size and silent reputation were enough to shield his solitary existence from the laws of men. The harsh truth had shattered his assumptions completely. The law did not care for the quiet dignity of the mountain. The law was an instrument of the greedy merchants and the prejudiced townsfolk, wielded with absolute, cruel precision. Nahimana watched the rigid, agonizing tension within his broad shoulders. She possessed a deeply compassionate heart, and she saw clearly that the silent giant was preparing to make an impossible, devastating choice. He was preparing to send her away. He would undoubtedly choose to dismantle the fragile life they had built, forcing her out into the cold wilderness alone, simply to ensure that the armed men of the town did not bring absolute, lethal destruction upon his secluded cabin. A profound, overwhelming terror gripped her resilient soul. She could not return to the muddy, hostile streets of the settlement. She could not survive the cruel judgment of the valley. More than mere physical survival, her bruised, healing heart refused absolutely to be separated from the silent, fiercely loyal protector. The emotional dependence she had developed upon his quiet presence was absolute and undeniable. She had to expose the hidden truth, no matter the terrible, personal cost to her own guarded privacy. She walked slowly toward the heavy oak table. She reached into the thick woolen satchel resting securely at her side. She retrieved the small, intricately carved wooden box. The wood was dark, polished by decades of careful hands, and sealed with a heavy, rusted iron latch. She placed the strange box directly onto the table, sliding the object across the scarred timber until it rested gently against his massive, calloused forearm. Thaddeus looked down at the box. His sharp eyes narrowed in profound confusion. He raised his heavy head, turning his intense, dark gaze toward her delicate face. He did not speak a word, but the profound, questioning silence of the mountain man begged for an explanation. Nahimana took a deep, trembling breath. She reached out with her slender fingers and unlatched the rusted iron hook. She lifted the heavy wooden lid. Inside the simple container rested a single, perfectly preserved, and official legal document. The paper was crisp, bearing the heavy, embossed wax seal of the territorial government and the clear, bold signature of the federal land commissioner. She carefully unfolded the document. She slid the official paper across the table toward his large, weathered hands. The townsfolk believe I am merely a trespassing, unwanted widow, Nahimana whispered softly into the warm, quiet room, her voice trembling slightly but radiating an immense, undeniable courage. They believe my late husband stole the ancestral land of his people and subsequently abandoned me to poverty. But the documented truth of this valley is fundamentally different from the cruel lies they preach. Thaddeus looked down at the official text. His sharp, dark eyes scanned the formal, written words with profound, growing astonishment. The legal document was drafted by a federal judge in the distant capital, the widow explained quietly. Her dark, sorrowful eyes locked firmly onto his bewildered face. My late husband was not a thief. He was a highly educated man of his nation who utilized the complex legal system of the white man to purchase this specific mountain ridge. He purchased the land entirely with his own funds, and he drafted a formal, ironclad deed assigning absolute, permanent ownership directly to me. Furthermore, the document clearly states his specific, sacred intention. He legally designated this high plateau as a permanent, sovereign refuge, a safe haven dedicated exclusively to the preservation and protection of the weaving arts of our displaced people. The massive chest of the mountain man hitched violently. The color drained completely from his weathered, tanned complexion. He stared at the official wax seal as if he had just seen a profound, life-altering miracle. He knew the cruel merchants would eventually attempt to drive me away. Nahimana murmured, a single, silent tear finally escaping her dark eyes, tracing a slow path down her delicate, pale cheek. He knew I would require a protector possessing immense strength, absolute courage, and a deep, unspoken respect for the silent resilience of the high country. He left me this heavy deed, and he left me the harsh trail leading straight to your door. He intended for me to find you, Thaddeus. The revelation struck the solitary giant with the force of a falling pine. The fundamental lie he had believed for his entire adult life. The lie that he was entirely alone in the universe. A monster banished permanently from the human world. Evaporated into the dancing light of the hearth. He was not an accidental guardian. He was the chosen instrument of a profound, far greater destiny. The protection he had instinctively provided to the fragile weaver was not merely a random act of mountain charity. It was the sacred fulfillment of a departed man. A beautiful, divine bridge spanning the massive gap between their vastly different, wounded worlds. The heavy silence of the cabin shifted once more, transforming from a barrier of shock into a profound, sacred acknowledgement of belonging. Thaddeus raised his massive, heavily scarred hand. He did not touch the document. Instead, his thick, calloused fingers hovered mere inches above the smooth, polished wood of the small carved box. His sharp eyes finally softening with an overwhelming, deeply emotional realization. Nahimana watched his internal, transformative paradigm shift occur in real time. He was no longer a solitary, detached wanderer of the timberline. He was a man with a profound purpose, a defender of a sacred legacy, and the absolute, undeniable protector of her beautiful, resilient life. Yet, the danger remained absolute. The sheriff and the greedy merchants possessed the armed force of the established valley law. They would not allow a piece of federal paper to deter their cruel greed without a vicious, desperate fight. The exposure of the true deed changed their emotional goal entirely. They were no longer merely hiding from the law. They were preparing to make a definitive, historic stand for the sacred refuge of the mountain. What devastating, violent measures would the corrupt lawman take when he discovered that the fragile widow held the legal right to the very soil he had promised to steal? The official territorial deed remained flat upon the heavy oak table, the bold black ink commanding absolute authority over the rough-hewn timber. Thaddeus did not look toward the frosted window. He kept his sharp, dark eyes locked firmly upon the heavy wax seal of the federal land commissioner. The paradigm shift had completely altered the foundation of his existence. He was no longer a solitary outcast hiding from the sins of the valley. He was the designated guardian of a sacred legacy, the chosen protector of the sovereign refuge. The massive, bulging muscles of his broad shoulders relaxed slightly, but a deep, dangerous, and highly focused intensity settled permanently into the harsh lines of his angular face. Nahimana observed his quiet transformation with a profound sense of emotional safety. She gently closed the lid of the intricately carved wooden box and latched the rusted iron hook. She returned the precious container to the dark depths of her thick woolen satchel. She knew the corrupt sheriff and the greedy merchants would ascend the treacherous mountain trail within a matter of days. They would arrive with armed men, shouting threats, demanding the land, and attempting to destroy the fragile life she had fought so desperately to build. The imminent threat of violence did not cause her to tremble. She possessed an unbreakable, quiet resilience, and she knew her dedicated defender would stand as an unyielding wall of stone against their cruel greed. The immediate escalation of their stakes demanded immediate, decisive action. The impending conflict would not be won with simple silence. The sacred refuge required a powerful, undeniable symbol of unity, a profound, physical declaration of belonging that would echo loudly down into the hostile valley. Nahimana walked over to the wooden corner where her newly constructed, large standing ash loom rested. She had spent the long, freezing weeks of the winter carefully spinning exceptionally strong, thick wool from the raw fleece Thaddeus had scavenged from an abandoned high country sheep pen. She retrieved several massive spools of yarn, dyed with rich ochre, deep crimson, and dark forest green. She sat gracefully upon her wooden stool, positioning her slender, petite figure directly before the towering vertical frame. She began to weave with a fierce, absolute, and deeply passionate intensity. The delicate fingers of the widow danced across the tight, thick warp with breathtaking speed. She was not merely creating a functional textile. She was pouring the very depths of her resilient soul, the long history of her displaced people, and her profound, unspoken devotion to the giant mountain man into every single, meticulous pass of the shuttle. Thaddeus stepped away from the oak table. He walked over to the stone hearth, retrieved a large, heavy log of fragrant cedar, and placed the wood deliberately onto the bright, red coals. He rose to his full, terrifying height. He walked across the room and stood silently behind the seated weaver. He did not speak a syllable. He merely crossed his massive, heavily muscled arms across his broad chest, assuming his natural, permanent position as her dedicated, unyielding barrier. He cast a massive, protective shadow over the entire loom, shielding her delicate back from the cold drafts of the log walls. This subtle, recurring habit of absolute presence provided Nahimana with a deep, radiating emotional safety. The rhythmic, steady clack of the wooden shuttle filled the warm room, creating a beautiful, harmonious soundtrack of survival and quiet belonging. Hour after hour, the intricate pattern developed upon the loom. The vivid colors intertwined to showcase a majestic, towering mountain peak guarded by two massive, ancient pines, standing strong and completely unbreakable against a violent, dark sky. The sheer, undeniable artistry of the blanket radiated a profound dignity, serving as a powerful, visual testament to the sacred legacy the federal deed had legally established upon the high ridge. As the deep shadows of the late afternoon began to stretch across the rustic cabin, Nahimana carefully tied off the final, vibrant crimson thread. She reached for her small bone scissors, clipping the wool with absolute precision. She unrolled the heavy, magnificent blanket from the ash frame, holding the thick, warm fabric out before her slender form. Thaddeus leaned his massive, weathered head forward, his sharp eyes examining the breathtaking tapestry. A profound, rarely seen emotion flickered softly within the intense depths of his dark gaze. He recognized the profound meaning woven directly into the geometric shapes. It was a blanket of profound protection, crafted specifically to shield his scarred, heavy heart from the lingering, painful guilt of his forgotten past. The widow stood up slowly from her wooden stool. She held the heavy, vibrant blanket in her slender, delicate hands. She stepped close to the massive, intimidating mountain man. The physical contrast between her petite, slender frame and his massive, bulging physique was breathtakingly stark, highlighting the beautiful harmony of their union. She did not raise the fabric to wrap his broad shoulders. Instead, she draped the beautiful textile meticulously over the heavy oak table, positioning the breathtaking tapestry directly beneath the official territorial deed. The blanket and the legal paper formed an undeniable, sacred altar of truth and belonging. They had established their definitive stand. They would not flee into the wilderness. They would not surrender the high plateau to the corrupt lawmen. They would defend the sovereign refuge with quiet dignity, unwavering courage, and the absolute power of their united spirits. The heavy and exhausting physical exertion of the day finally settled deeply into the delicate bones of Nahimana. She exhaled a long, weary sigh, her slender shoulders drooping slightly as the adrenaline slowly faded from her veins. Thaddeus observed her quiet fatigue immediately. The giant moved with astonishing, fluid grace for a man of his immense, hulking size. He walked straight toward the simple, narrow cot situated in the far corner of the cabin. He retrieved a thick, soft pillow stuffed with dried mountain moss. He carried the pillow across the room, placing the soft item gently onto the wooden chair near the radiant, life-saving heat of the roaring hearth. He stopped beside her standing form. He did not touch her delicate arm. He simply extended his massive, heavily collused hand, pointing his thick finger toward the comfortable chair with a deeply serious, unmistakable expression of tender care. This was the third beautiful warmth beat of the long, difficult day. A quiet, profound offering of rest, an unspoken respect for the immense, creative labor of her slender hands. Nahimana looked up into his weathered, masculine face. She offered a single, exceptionally brief nod of deep gratitude. She walked over to the chair and sat down slowly, resting her weary head against the soft moss pillow. The intense, golden glow of the dancing flames wrapped around her fragile form, providing a deep, radiating heat that completely chased away the biting chill of the mountain evening. Thaddeus returned to his dark, permanent post near the stone hearth. He stood perfectly still, resembling an ancient, immovable sentinel carved directly from the living rock of the peak. He kept his sharp, dark eyes fixed entirely upon the heavy oak door, his broad jaw clenched tightly in quiet anticipation of the violence undoubtedly traveling up the winding trail. As the absolute darkest, coldest hour of the high country night approached, the mountain man reached out to adjust the heavy iron kettle hanging over the red coals. His massive fingers brushed against a small, rough edge of the wooden mantle. He paused. He bent his heavy head downward, his sharp eyes noticing a small, dusty corner of the stone shelf he had ignored for countless, lonely years. He reached behind the scorched, mysterious fragment of native weaving he kept permanently displayed upon the stone. He pulled out a small, heavily yellowed piece of thick parchment. The paper was folded tightly, covered in a thick layer of fine ash and ancient dust. The giant held the small, fragile object in his massive, heavily scarred palm, his breathing immediately hitching within his broad, muscular chest. He walked slowly toward the dim, shadowy corner of the room, away from the bright glow of the hearth, desperately wishing to hide his profound shock from the resting widow. He utilized his thick, calloused thumb to carefully brush the accumulated dust from the fragile paper. He unfolded the faded text with trembling, exceptionally slow fingers. Inside the small, hidden letter rested a final, devastating request from the deeply tragic, buried past of the mountain man. Elias, the beloved brother he had failed to protect from the brutal violence of a ruthless gang of valley outlaws so many years ago, had penned a final, heartbreaking message before his untimely, agonizing demise. The sharp eyes of Thaddeus scanned the faded, familiar handwriting in the dim light. The written words struck his massive soul with the brutal, crushing force of a falling boulder. The tragic letter did not beg for vengeance. The dying brother offered a profound, liberating absolution, and Elias had left a specific, earth-shattering instruction for any person who might eventually discover the solitary, broken mountain man upon his high ridge. What astonishing, life-altering secret did the yellowed letter reveal? And how did the dying wish of his departed brother completely destroy the last remaining, painful barrier between the hardened heart of the giant and the beautiful, resilient life of the fragile widow? The dim, deep, flickering light of the hearth fire cast a long, trembling shadow against the log wall as Thaddeus stared at the fragile, yellowed paper in his massive hands. The words penned by his departed brother, Elias, were simple, soft, clear, and carried a weight more immense than the entire mountain range. The giant stood in the suffocating silence of the dark corner, his massive frame shaking with the force of a tectonic shift within his soul. He had lived in a self-imposed prison of grief and ironclad silence for nearly 2 decades, believing that his survival was a curse he had stolen from his brother. The letter had, retrieved from the cold stone mantle, shattered that dark, suffocating illusion forever. Elias had not begged for vengeance against the men who took his life. He had not cursed the world for the brutality of the frontier. In his final, graceful strokes, he had written a mandate of life, not a ledger of death. He had instructed his older brother to seek out, not the ghosts of the past, but the living warmth of a future. The final lines urged Thaddeus to find someone who brought creation into the world, someone who understood the value of every thread, for in that creation, there was true, lasting redemption. Thaddeus folded the paper with hands that were finally steady. The thick, calloused skin of his thumbs brushed the brittle edges of the letter one last time before he tucked the note into his leather vest, close against his own beating heart. He walked out of the shadows, his massive, heavy boots making no sound upon the floorboards. Nahimana remained resting upon the chair near the fire, her dark eyes open, watching the dancing flames with a quiet, observant grace. She had noticed the moment he moved away from the hearth. She had felt the sudden, inexplicable shift in the air of the cabin, the way the crushing, heavy tension that had draped over his broad shoulders for weeks suddenly evaporated. He stopped before her. He did not tower over her with his usual, distant posture of protection. He knelt. His massive, muscular frame sank down until he was at eye level with her seated, slender form. The sight of the giant, a man who had faced wild beasts and the cruelest elements without a blink, lowering himself to such a humble position, was a revelation of profound, vulnerable intimacy. He did not speak immediately. He reached out with a massive, weathered hand, hesitating for a heartbeat, before placing his palm gently against the rough, warm wool of the blanket she had woven. He looked into her face, his sharp, dark eyes no longer reflecting the cold, gray flint of the mountain. They were soft, filled with a raw, terrifyingly honest admission of his own brokenness. "I have spent 20 winters believing I was the reason for the silence of this ridge," he breathed, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. "I believed the world deserved only my absence, for I had failed the only light I had ever known." Nahimana reached out, covering his massive, scarred hand with her own delicate, slender fingers. Her touch was a warm anchor, pulling him further into the light of the present. She did not ask him for the details of the letter. She understood, with the profound intuition of a weaver, that the knots of his past were finally beginning to loosen, and he needed only the patience of a steady hand to help him unspool them. "You have not been living in silence, Thaddeus," she whispered, her voice gentle and steady, carrying the quiet authority of her resilience. "You have been waiting. The mountain does not stay silent because it is empty. It stays silent so that the truth may eventually be heard." He leaned his heavy, weary head forward, allowing his brow to rest against her palm for a singular, sacred moment. It was a gesture of complete, unyielding surrender. He was no longer the protector who kept the world at bay. He was a man who had finally allowed someone to walk through the gate. They shared the warmth of the fire, the quiet, steady rhythm of their breathing merging into a single, peaceful pulse of existence. In the small, desolate cabin, the distance between them vanished, replaced by an emotional closeness that felt like the inevitable settling of two stones against one another in a strong current. They belonged to this place, and they belonged to this moment. The hours stretched into the deep, dead quiet of the night. The storm that had ravaged the peaks for days had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind an unnatural, crystalline stillness. The world outside the log walls was covered in a thick, insulating blanket of white, muffling the world to an eerie, breathless degree. The eerie silence was a stark contrast to the profound, newfound peace within the cabin. Thaddeus eventually rose, moving with a fluid, silent grace to secure the heavy, iron bolt on the door. He checked the fire once more, banking the coals with a heavy shovel to ensure the heat would last until the morning. He stood by the window, his gaze scanning the vast, silvery landscape of the ridge. The moonlight reflected off the fresh, deep drifts, creating a stark, high-contrast world of shadow and brilliance. "The mountain is watching," he murmured, his sharp eyes narrowing as he scanned the edge of the dense pine thicket. "What do you see?" Nahimana asked, her voice barely a breath. She stood up, smoothing the front of her flowing dress, her senses instantly sharpening, the quiet resilience of her spirit rising to meet the shift in the air. "I see the stillness of the owl," he replied, his voice tense, stripped of its earlier, softened warmth. "The mountain is too quiet. The predators have retreated, and the prey is hiding. There is a presence in the tree line that does not belong to the wild." He did not reach for his knife. He reached for the heavy, iron-bound rifle he kept mounted above the mantel, a relic of his past he rarely touched. He checked the mechanism with the precise, methodical movements of a man who understood the final, irreversible nature of the tools of violence. Nahimana walked to his side, her small frame standing in the shadow of his massive, coiled strength. She looked into the tree line, searching for the anomaly he had spotted. The trees were black, skeletal fingers reaching toward the silver moon. Everything was still. Everything was frozen in the icy grip of the mountain winter. "Are they here?" she asked, her voice steady despite the hammer of fear against her ribs. "They are waiting for the cold to break," he muttered, his jaw tightening. "They are testing the path. They are waiting for a mistake." He drew the heavy wool curtain over the window, plunging the cabin back into the amber, flickering warmth of the hearth fire. He stood in front of the door, his posture no longer that of a man resting, but of a sentinel preparing for the final, inevitable trial of his endurance. The silence inside the cabin was deep, profound, and heavy with the weight of what was to come. Nahimana sat back in her chair, her hands instinctively moving to her lap, her fingers tracing the patterns of her own loomwork as she prayed for the resilience of the earth itself. They were ready. The revelation of the letter had stripped away the last of his fear, leaving only the focused, clear-eyed resolve of a protector who had finally found something worth defending. Then, the night cracked. It was a sharp, biting sound, a violent interruption that shattered the stillness of the ridge. A single, metallic gunshot rang out in the distance, a thunderous echo that rolled across the valley and bounced off the granite cliffs with devastating, reverberating power. The sound was not muffled by the snow. It was a declaration. It was a signal. Thaddeus moved before the sound had even faded, his massive body lunging toward the shadows. The peaceful warmth of the evening evaporated instantly, replaced by the electric, chilling certainty that the threat had arrived, and the long, quiet wait was officially over. Had the men from the town finally gathered their courage to strike? Or was the sound a warning of a more immediate, terrifying danger stalking the tree line? The sharp, metallic ring of the gunshot died away, leaving only the oppressive, heavy silence of the frozen ridge. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, the rhythmic crunch of heavy boots against deep, crusty snow emerged from the darkness of the pines. Thaddeus did not flinch. He stood like a monolith of dark stone in the center of the room, his hand tightening over the barrel of the iron-bound rifle. He turned his heavy head toward Nahimana, his dark eyes reflecting the dying embers of the hearth. He did not speak, but the look he cast upon her, a mix of raw, protective ferocity and a terrifying tenderness, communicated everything. He placed a massive, calloused hand gently upon her shoulder, his fingers steadying her. "Do not move from the center of the room," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that cut through the sudden, biting cold of the draft entering from beneath the door. He did not wait for her reply. He strode toward the heavy oak door, his massive physique dwarfing the very structure of the cabin. He threw the bolt and kicked the door outward, stepping directly into the freezing, moonlit expanse of the high ridge. Nahimana pressed her hands to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Outside, the darkness erupted into points of flickering orange light. Torches. A dozen or more men emerged from the shadows of the tree line, their faces obscured by scarves and the low brims of their wool hats. They held burning brands of pine and pitch, their intent as clear as the suffocating smell of smoke that began to drift into the cabin. The sheriff stood at the front of the group, his coat flapping in the sudden gusts of wind. He shouted something that was lost to the howling gale, but the gesture was unmistakable. He raised his arm, and the men surged forward, Thaddeus roared. A sound that seemed to pull the very spirit of the mountain from the granite peaks. It was not a cry of fear, it was the warning of an apex predator. He lunged into the line of men. He moved with a speed that defied his massive bulk. A swirling force of iron muscle and relentless intent. From the doorway, Nahimana watched in paralyzed awe. The giant blocked their path, his arms swinging with the force of falling timber. He did not strike with malice, he struck with the cold, efficient necessity of a man protecting his own. One by one, the attackers were cast backward, stumbling into the deep, unforgiving drifts of snow. But the men were not alone in their cruelty. As the giant turned to shove a man away from the threshold, another rushed to the side of the cabin, pressing a burning torch directly against the dry, resin-heavy logs of the exterior wall. The wood hissed and flared instantly. A lick of hungry, orange flame climbed the wall, consuming the bark and turning the sanctuary of the cabin into a target. Nahimana gasped, stumbling toward the wall. She grabbed a bucket of water from the stone hearth, her hands shaking, and flung the liquid against the exterior, the sizzle of steam rising to join the acrid scent of smoke. She fought the fire, her fingers raw from the heat, her eyes stinging from the encroaching haze. Outside, the battle intensified. The men were desperate, their greed fueling their violence. They swarmed the giant, attempting to use their numbers to drag him down. The cabin walls groaned under the impact of the struggle. Thaddeus was a wall of muscle, deflecting their blows. But the sheer weight of the mob began to drive him back, toward the edge of the clearing. A sharp, that agonizing crack echoed, not a gunshot, but the sound of the porch structure, splintering under the pressure of the fight. The cabin tilted, the foundation shifting as the men ripped at the support beams. Thaddeus realized the strategy. They did not intend to kill him there. They intended to burn the refuge to the ground with them inside. He shifted his stance, his face a mask of primal determination. He gripped the nearest attacker by his heavy coat and flung him aside with such force that the man landed 20 feet away, sliding into the darkness. He turned his gaze back toward the cabin, his sharp, dark eyes scanning the room to ensure Nahimana remained safe. He saw the flames licking at the window frame, the wood beginning to char and blacken. The look he gave her was not of goodbye, but of a vow. He turned and charged the remaining group, drawing them away from the cabin, forcing them to pursue him into the deeper, darker woods where the trees would negate their numbers. They surged after him, a pack of wolves chasing a bear. "Thaddeus!" Nahimana cried out, her voice cracking in the freezing air. But the wind snatched the name from her lips. He did not look back. He vanished into the black, snowy expanse of the timberline, the torches bobbing and flickering behind him. Moving rapidly away from the clearing, Nahimana rushed to the door, the heat from the charred wood searing her face. She stood upon the threshold, staring into the abyss of the forest. The shouting grew distant, the sounds of scuffling and the heavy thud of boots fading into the quiet, snow-choked night. She ran to the perimeter of the clearing, her feet sinking deep into the powder. She scanned the tree line, searching for the massive silhouette of the mountain man, for the dark fur coat that promised safety and warmth. But there was only the shifting play of shadows and the eerie, cold glow of the moon. The fire on the cabin wall flickered and died, starved of fuel as she had managed to douse the main source. But the silence that replaced the battle was far more terrifying than the noise. She returned to the cabin, the floorboards cold and silent. The hearth fire had burned low, the room cooling rapidly. She moved through the space, touching the items he had left behind, the heavy hunting knife on the table, the small, smooth river willow he had carved for her. Everything was where he had placed it. But he was not. She stood in the center of the cabin, the smoke still clinging to her clothes, her chest aching with a hollow, profound emptiness. The cabin, once a place of healing and sanctuary, felt like a hollowed-out shell, stripped of the soul that had occupied it. She waited. She paced the length of the room, her slender hands clutching her own arms to ward off the encroaching chill. She told herself he was merely drawing them out. She told herself he would return as he always had, with the mountain air clinging to his furs and the steady, unbreakable calm in his eyes. But the hours ticked by, the clock on the mantel ticking with a rhythmic, indifferent precision. The moon crossed the sky and began its descent, casting long, skeletal fingers of shadow across the floor. She went back to the door, again and again. Each time, she expected to see the massive, hulking form emerging from the trees. Each time, she was met with the same biting, relentless, and mocking silence of the high ridge. The realization began to settle in her bones, cold and heavy as the mountain ice. The giant had not returned. He had faced a dozen men. He had faced the fire. He had faced the darkness of the woods to ensure her survival. Had he managed to outrun them? Or had the weight of their numbers finally pulled the mountain man down into the snow? Nahimana knelt beside the hearth, the tears finally coming, hot and silent against her cold, pale skin. She looked at the woven blanket she had made, the symbol of their protection, lying on the table. It seemed fragile now, a thin layer of wool against the crushing reality of the world below. She stood up, her jaw setting in a firm, resolute line. She would not wait for the morning to bring news. She would not sit in the quiet of the cabin while the fate of the man who had defended her remained unknown. She reached for the heavy, woolen cloak hanging by the door, wrapping it tightly around her slender shoulders. She grabbed a small lantern. The glass cracked from the earlier heat, and ignited the wick with a trembling hand. She stepped out into the night, the freezing air biting at her lungs. She looked toward the dark, ominous wall of the timberline where he had disappeared. What had become of the guardian of the mountain? And would the trail of blood and broken snow reveal a victory, or a loss that she could never hope to heal from? The blizzard was a blinding, suffocating wall of white, a relentless force of nature that sought to erase all existence from the high ridge. Nahimana moved forward with the desperate, jagged rhythm of a wounded bird. Her lantern swung wildly, casting long, frantic arcs of light against the swirling powder. The cold was a physical weight, a sharp blade that sliced through her thick woolen cloak and pressed against her very marrow. Every breath she drew was a crystalline sting in her throat. She did not stop. She could not stop. The memory of the giant, the man who had stood as the unshakable foundation of her sanctuary, pushed her onward through the abyss. She followed the path, where the snow had been violently churned. The deep, heavy impressions of his massive boots were being rapidly filled. But here and there, the dark, stained reality of the struggle remained. A torn piece of his coarse shirt caught on a jagged pine branch, flapping in the wind like a distress signal. She reached for it, her fingers stiff and numb, and pressed the fabric to her chest. It smelled of him, of cedar, mountain air, and the metallic tang of blood. She navigated the treacherous incline, her legs burning, her spirit focused entirely on the singular point of his survival. She found him in the hollow of a rocky outcropping, sheltered from the absolute worst of the wind by a massive, leaning spruce. He was lying on his side, a mountain of a man reduced to stillness. The snow had begun to mound against his back, covering him in a shroud of white that made him appear as nothing more than a fallen boulder. Nahimana dropped her lantern, the glass shattering, though the flame miraculously held within the metal cage. She scrambled to his side, throwing herself into the drifts. She reached out, her hands frantic, that pressing against his neck. The skin was ice cold, but beneath the thick, weathered surface, she felt a pulse. It was slow, dangerously faint, but it existed. "Thaddeus," she breathed, her voice a ragged plea lost in the wind. "Thaddeus, wake up." There was no movement. His massive chest, usually a cavern of steady, rhythmic strength, was shallow and labored. His coat was ripped to ribbons, and a dark, frozen patch of red marked his shoulder where a blade had clearly found purchase. The realization that he had fought them off, that he had led them away to ensure her safety, crashed over her with the force of a tidal wave. He had sacrificed his own strength, his own warmth, to protect the delicate, fragile life she held. She could not leave him here. She knew she possessed no strength to lift him, but she possessed the strength of an unbreakable spirit. She began to clear the snow from around his body, her hands working with the desperate, efficient speed of a woman saving her own soul. She tugged at his belt, using the leverage of the rocks to slide him inches at a time toward the trail. It was an agonizing, slow labor. Every muscle in her petite frame screamed in protest, but she ignored the agony. She wrapped her own cloak around his exposed torso, tying the edges with shaking, fumbling knots. She hauled him. She dragged. She moved with the focus of a woman possessed, whispering fragments of old songs, pleading with the mountain to spare him. The path back to the cabin felt like an eternity, a blurred sequence of falling, rising, and pulling. When the rough logs of the cabin finally materialized through the storm, she had no strength left. She used the last reserve of her energy to shove the heavy door open and pull him across the threshold, into the dim, cooling warmth of the hearth. She collapsed, breathless and weeping, but she did not allow herself to rest. She hauled the last of the dry wood onto the fire, feeding the flames until the room began to glow with a frantic, desperate intensity. She stripped away his frozen, blood-soaked furs. She worked with the precision of a healer, washing his skin with the last of the snow water, bandaging the deep, angry gashes that mapped his torso. As the heat of the fire began to seep into the room, Thaddeus stirred. His massive, calloused hands gripped the edge of the cot, the knuckles turning white. His eyes, clouded and distant, fluttered open. He looked at the ceiling, then shifted his heavy head, his sharp, dark eyes locking onto the face of the woman kneeling beside him. "You should not have come," he rasped, his voice a broken, hollow sound that seemed to scrape against the rafters. Nahimana dipped a fresh cloth into the water, wringing it out with steady, resolute hands. She did not answer his rebuke. She leaned over him, her dark hair falling forward to veil them in a curtain of intimate shadow, and began to wipe the sweat from his forehead. "You are here," she murmured, her voice steady, though her hands trembled. "That is all that matters." Thaddeus turned his face away from her, the muscles in his jaw tight. A profound, agonizing shame darkened his features. He looked at his own hands, the hands that had dismantled men, the hands that had brought violence to the threshold of their peace. He saw them as instruments of destruction, not tools of protection. "I brought the darkness to your door," he muttered, the words thick with self-loathing. "I am a creature of the mountain, of the shadows. I was meant to stay away from the light. I promised myself I would not let the world touch you. And yet, I was the one who pulled the storm down upon your head." Nahimana froze, the cloth hovering above his chest. She saw the crushing weight of his belief, the belief that his presence was a corruption, a stain upon the sanctuary they had built. He was retreating into the prison of his own mind, distancing himself from her, building an emotional wall that was far harder to breach than any physical barrier. "You saved me," she said, her voice soft but insistent, forcing him to meet her gaze. "You defended this home. Do not dare to call yourself a curse when you are the only reason I am breathing this air." Thaddeus shook his head slowly, a single, jagged tear tracking through the grime on his cheek. He looked at her with a raw, terrifying vulnerability that stripped away the last of the mountain man's stoic armor. "You do not understand," he breathed, his voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire. "I have lived for years with the ghost of my brother, convinced that my survival was a mistake. I thought I had found redemption in you. I thought I could be the man who deserved to stand beside you." He reached out, his massive fingers ghosting over her cheek, a touch that was searing in its gentleness. "But I see now that I have only brought you the same violence that destroyed my blood. You deserve a life of peace, a life far from the reach of men like me. If I stay, I will only bring more fire. I will only bring more blood." He closed his eyes, his breathing ragged. He was preparing to push her away, to force her to leave him for her own safety. He was ready to face the long, cold winter entirely alone, convinced that his sacrifice was the only way to ensure her survival. "I have done you a terrible wrong," he whispered. A final, heartbreaking admission. "I have made you care for a monster." Nahimana felt the floor beneath her sway. She knew that, if she could not reach through the darkness of his heart, if she could not shatter the lie he had built around his own soul, she would lose him, not to death, but to the silence of his own self-imposed exile. What could she possibly say? What truth could she reveal that would convince him he was not a monster, but the very man she had been waiting for? The silence within the cabin grew heavy, cold, and entirely suffocating. Thaddeus did not speak. He did not look toward her when he moved about the small, cramped room. He acted with a mechanical, distant efficiency that shattered the warm, shared rhythm they had established over the long, brutal winter. His massive body, still bruised and stiff from the violent struggle with the town men, seemed to occupy even more space than usual, as if his internal turmoil demanded a physical manifestation. He avoided the light of the hearth. He remained in the deep shadows, his broad back a constant, impenetrable wall of rejection. Nahimana watched him from her chair, her heart aching with a profound, hollow sense of loss. She observed how he sharpened his hunting knife, the rhythmic shing-shing of the steel against the whetstone a jarring, metallic sound that echoed like a funeral bell. He was not sharpening it for the hunt. He was sharpening it to ensure he could provide for himself when he was once again entirely alone. He was preparing the cabin for a life of absolute solitude. He was purging his sanctuary of her presence, convinced that his own violent nature was a contagion that threatened her fragile safety. He believed he had terrified her. He believed that the glimpse of the monster, the man who could break bones and spill blood, was the only thing she would remember of him. He did not realize that the memory she held most tightly was not of the violence he inflicted, but of the gentleness with which he had tended the fire, the way he had placed the moss-stuffed pillow, and the absolute, unwavering dedication he had shown to her survival. He thought he was protecting her by casting her out. He did not understand that to cast her out was to destroy the very home he had spent a lifetime building in his heart. Days passed in a blur of forced, painful distance. When Thaddeus spoke, which was rare, his voice was flat, devoid of the deep, resonant warmth that had once stirred something dormant within her soul. He began to organize her belongings. He placed her dried herbs, her spare garments, and the heavy, intricately carved wooden box upon the rough timber of the table, grouping them as if they were items to be collected by a traveler. He was essentially packing for her. He was mapping her exit from the mountain. Nahimana stood at the window, watching the late winter snow fall in thick, lazy flakes. She saw the way he struggled to lift the heavy firewood with his injured arm, his face twisted in a mask of stoic pain. She wanted to rush to his side. She wanted to press her hand against his scarred skin, to assure him that he was no monster, that his protection was the most beautiful act of love she had ever witnessed. But the wall of silence he had erected was absolute. He would not allow her to heal him. He would not allow her to offer the comfort she knew he desperately craved, because he felt unworthy of it. The insecurity that gripped him was a deep, festering wound. He looked at her and saw a woman who belonged in a world of soft light and gentle voices, a world where the law provided order and safety. He saw himself and knew only the dark, jagged history of blood and bone. He convinced himself that any moment she spent with him was a moment stolen from her true potential, that he was merely a cruel joke turned into a destiny she had not asked for. He thought she was merely enduring his presence out of a misplaced sense of duty or fear. On the third morning of this agonizing, silent withdrawal, Nahimana began to pack. She did not reach for her meager clothes. She did not gather her blankets. She moved with a calculated, precise energy, her mind entirely fixed upon the mission she had determined was necessary. She took the large, thick sack that had once held their grain. She walked to the hearth, where Thaddeus sat, his head bowed, his eyes fixed upon the floorboards as he carved a piece of scrap wood. She began to place the items of the cabin into the sack. She did not take her own things. She took the federal deed. She took the letter Elias had written, the letter that had finally provided Thaddeus with the absolution he was too broken to accept. She took the small, sturdy shears, the iron ladle, and the heaviest of the wool blankets. Thaddeus watched her movements from beneath the heavy, dark curtain of his hair. His jaw tightened. He interpreted her actions as the final, absolute rejection. He believed she was gathering her possessions, preparing to flee the mountain forever, eager to escape the shadow of the man who had brought so much chaos to her life. He did not ask her where she was going. He did not ask her why she was taking the items she had gathered. He simply looked away, his knuckles white against the wood he was carving, his heart silently shattering into 1,000 irreparable pieces. He felt a deep, piercing pang of jealousy, not for a rival man, but for the life she would have without him. He envied the world that would welcome her back, the world that would never know the violence he had committed, the world that would offer her the peace and security he knew he could never provide. He resented the very wind that would carry her down from his ridge, and he despised himself for being the one who had finally made the decision to set her free. Nahimana finished her packing. The sack was heavy, filled with the tools of their survival and the evidence of their legal right to the land. She approached him, standing before him for a long, quiet moment. She wanted to tell him that she was going down to the valley to bring the fight to the sheriff, that she was going to use the law to burn his enemies to the ground, so that he would never have to bleed for her again. But the look in his eyes stopped her. He was so deeply entrenched in his own shame, so blinded by the belief that she was terrified of him, that she realized words would not reach him. He was waiting for her to leave. He was bracing for the moment she walked out the door, believing that his life would once again return to the hollow, meaningless silence of the high timberline. She could not stay. But she could not tell him the truth. To tell him would be to make him a participant in the danger, and she knew he would refuse to let her go. He would try to stop her. He would try to come with her. And if he did, the town would surely kill him. She had to leave him believing she was abandoning him. She had to break his heart in order to save his life. She turned away, the heavy sack slung over her slender shoulder. She walked toward the door, her pace measured, her back straight. "I am going," she said, her voice a soft, steady whisper that carried no hint of the storm raging within her own soul. Thaddeus did not stand. He did not look up. He sat in the darkness, the carving knife motionless in his grip. "I know," he murmured, his voice sounding like dry, dead leaves skittering across the stone. "You are where you belong." She opened the door. The biting, freezing wind of the high country rushed into the room, swirling around her ankles like a ghostly shroud. She stepped out onto the porch, the white, brilliant world of the mountain blinding her for a brief, agonizing second. She looked back once. She saw him sitting by the fire, a solitary, massive figure slumped in the gloom, a man who had finally achieved the isolation he had spent 20 years fearing. He did not turn. He did not wave. He did not bid her farewell. She pulled the door shut behind her, the heavy latch clicking into place with a final, definitive sound that signaled the end of their sanctuary. She began the long, perilous descent down the mountain, her feet sinking into the snow, the heavy sack dragging against her spine. She was not running away. She was not leaving him. She was walking straight into the heart of the enemy, and she was carrying the only weapons that mattered. She would reach the town. She would stand before the judge. She would demand justice for the sacred refuge of the mountain. And when she returned, she would return to the giant, or she would die trying to clear the path for him to finally live in the light. The storm intensified, the white clouds swirling around her, consuming her figure until she was nothing more than a dark, determined speck against the vast, indifferent face of the mountain. Thaddeus remained in the cabin, the silence now absolute, a tomb of his own making, unaware that the woman he loved had not abandoned him, but was currently walking into a fire to secure his future. Would the town recognize the woman who had returned? And what fate awaited the widow when she demanded that the corrupt law return what was rightfully hers? The descent from the high ridge was a brutal, unrelenting gauntlet of frozen air and jagged stone. Nahimana moved with a singular, terrifying focus. The heavy sack pressed into the small of her back, the weight a constant, grounding reminder of the document contained within. Henver, her fingers, exposed to the biting wind, turned a dull, painful blue. Yet she did not retreat into the shelter of her heavy cloak. She navigated the treacherous, icy switchbacks with the instinct of a mountain goat, her eyes fixed on the distant, hazy outline of the valley town below. She was not fleeing. She was marching toward a confrontation that would define the rest of her existence. The exhaustion that plagued her muscles was secondary to the white-hot intensity of her purpose. She was the Weaver, and she was going to undo the threads of injustice that bound the mountain. Inside the cabin, the silence had transformed into a crushing, physical weight. Thaddeus remained sitting by the dying embers of the hearth, his large frame hunched, his hands resting upon his knees. The stillness was not the peace of the mountain. It was the hollow, echoing void of a man who believed he had finally achieved his own destruction. He stared at the empty space on the oak table, where the intricately carved wooden box had once rested. He looked toward the corner, where the grain sack had sat, now vanished along with her presence. He closed his eyes, expecting the emptiness to feel like relief, but it felt like drowning. His chest heaved with the effort of every breath. He thought of the way she had looked at him before she left. Not with fear, but with a strange, enigmatic resolve he had failed to decipher. He touched his own chest, feeling the sharp, agonizing ache of the wound she had stitched with such delicate, perfect care. A sudden, sharp realization pierced through his fog of misery. The deed. The letter from Elias. She had taken them. Why would a woman fleeing for her life take the deed to the very land she was purportedly abandoning? Why would she take the letter that represented the only truth he had ever known? He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the searing pain in his bandaged side. He surged toward the door, his massive boots striking the floorboards with a thunderous impact. He threw the heavy oak door open, the wind howling into the room to greet him. He scanned the snow outside, looking for the telltale signs of her departure. He saw the path she had taken, a straight, deliberate line leading not toward the safety of the lowland forests where travelers hid, but toward the exposed, dangerous descent into the valley. She was going to the town. She was going to face the men who had threatened them. The blood turned to ice in his veins. He knew the cruelty of the valley folk. He knew the sheriff's cold, unforgiving nature. If she arrived there alone, with nothing but a piece of paper and her own fragile, defiant spirit, they would tear her apart. They would view her return as a surrender, or, worse, an affront to their authority. Thaddeus did not hesitate. He lunged into the storm. His massive body moved with a desperate, wild velocity, his legs eating the distance, his lungs burning with the sharp, freezing air. He was a force of nature, a mountain man possessed by the singular, overwhelming necessity of reaching her before the town did. He did not care about his wounds. He did not care about the cold that bit into his unprotected skin. He cared only for the silhouette of the woman he had tried to cast away, the woman who had carried his redemption in a sack over her shoulder. The town appeared through the swirling mist like a jagged, wooden scar upon the landscape. Nahimana stumbled as she reached the outskirts, her strength finally beginning to ebb. Her boots were ruined, the leather soles thin and shredded by the sharp scree of the path. She stood at the edge of the muddy, frozen street, her dark hair matted with frost, her face pale as parchment. She looked like a ghost appearing from the wilderness. The townsfolk, who had been huddled within the warmth of the general store and the tavern, began to emerge as she appeared in the center of the square. They recognized her instantly. The merchant from the weaving stall stepped forward, a sneer twisting his features. He saw the woman, the outsider, the widow who had defied them, appearing broken and alone. Nahimana did not flinch. She stood in the center of the mud, her back straight, her hands trembling as she reached into the heavy sack. She did not pull out a weapon. She pulled out the federal deed. The paper crisp and authoritative against the drab, gray background of the street. The sheriff emerged from his office, his hand hovering near his holster. He walked toward her with a predatory, slow gait. His eyes narrowed with a mix of suspicion and amusement. He expected her to plead. He expected her to beg for mercy or to ask for a place to sleep before she vanished back into the wild. "You have made a grave mistake returning here, woman," the sheriff declared, his voice cutting through the silence of the square. "The time for your trespassing is finished." Nahimana did not lower her eyes. She held the deed out toward him, her voice clear and resonant, carrying the weight of the mountain itself. "I am not trespassing," she stated, her words echoing against the wooden walls of the buildings. "I am claiming what is mine by the law of the land, and I am demanding that you honor the rights of the mountain." The townspeople began to crowd around, their murmurs growing into a low, threatening roar. The merchant stepped forward, ready to snatch the paper from her hand, his greed overcoming his fear. Just as the sheriff reached for her arm, a shadow fell across the square, a shadow so massive and so dark that the entire crowd went instantly silent. The ground beneath them seemed to vibrate with the heavy, rhythmic thud of a man who did not walk so much as reclaim the earth with every step. Thaddeus arrived. He was a sight of terrifying, primeval power. His shirt was torn, his bandages stained with fresh blood, his hair a wild, frozen mane of dark locks. He stood at the entrance to the square, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a lethal, focused rage. He did not look at the town. He looked only at Nahimana, who stood in the center of the hostile circle, her head held high. The sheriff froze. The merchant recoiled. The mountain man had descended, and he had brought the storm with him. Nahimana saw him, and for a fleeting, beautiful second, her weary, stoic expression broke. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, a look of profound, silent understanding. She had not come to ask for his help. She had come to fight for their future, and he had come to stand beside her, just as he had promised. Thaddeus walked into the center of the circle. He did not say a word to the townspeople. He did not need to. He moved with a heavy, deliberate slowness, placing his massive body directly behind Nahimana, forming an unbreakable, towering shield. He looked at the sheriff, his eyes cold, sharp, and entirely devoid of mercy. The lawman stepped back, his hand shaking near his weapon. He knew the difference between a man who fights for property and a man who fights for the only thing he has left in the world. "The lady has business with the council," Thaddeus rumbled, his voice a low, dangerous sound that seemed to vibrate in the very chests of the men around him. "And you will listen to every word she speaks." The tension in the square was absolute, a taut, vibrating wire that threatened to snap at the slightest touch. The townspeople, who had been so eager to see the weaver broken, now found themselves facing a giant who had returned from the dead to defend her honor. Nahimana turned to the council building, her hand resting against the heavy, coarse fabric of the shirt Thaddeus wore. She had walked into the fire, and she had emerged, not alone, but with the mountain at her back. She stepped toward the heavy, wooden doors of the town council, prepared to lay the truth at their feet. But as she reached for the latch, the sheriff took a final, desperate step forward, his face flushed with the humiliation of his own fear. What ultimatum would he issue to stop them? And would the council dare to side with the greed of the town over the undeniable, legal truth of the mountain? The heavy wooden doors of the town council chamber creaked open, groaning under the sheer, unyielding force of the mountain man. Thaddeus did not push with anger. He pushed with the inexorable, crushing weight of truth. The sheriff, Tarsip, caught off balance by the giant's advance, stumbled backward into the dusty lobby. His face flushed a deep, mottled red. Inside the chamber, the town council sat arranged behind a long, scarred table of dark oak. They were men of aging faces and hard, set eyes, men who had profited for years from the slow, systematic dismantling of the native claims in the valley. They looked up from their ledgers and maps, startled by the intrusion. Nahimana stepped into the room. She held her head high, the mud of the road clinging to her hem, the cold wind of the ridge still lingering in her hair. She walked to the center of the room, her presence surprisingly formidable, as if she carried the towering strength of the peaks within her small frame. Thaddeus moved to stand beside her, his massive shadow casting a pall over the men who had plotted their downfall. He did not look at the council. He looked only at the widow, his presence a silent, terrifying vow that he would burn the building to the ground before he allowed them to harm her again. The claim of the estate is fraudulent. The sheriff sputtered, regaining his composure and pointing a trembling finger at the document clutched in the hand of the widow. That paper is a forgery, drafted by someone who wished to subvert the established order of this valley. Nahimana did not wait for the judge to speak. She walked to the table and laid the deed flat upon the wood. The embossed seal of the federal government seemed to glow in the dim light of the gas lamps. The judge, an elderly man with spectacles perched precariously on his nose, peered at the paper. He reached out, his skin like parchment, and touched the seal. The silence in the room became absolute, a thick, suffocating thing that made it impossible to ignore the racing of hearts. "This is an official territorial decree," the judge murmured, his voice sounding thin and brittle. "It bears the signature of the commissioner. Where did you obtain this?" "It was left to me by my husband," Nahimana answered, her voice clear, steady, and devoid of the fear they had expected. "He did not steal the land. He bought it to ensure it remained a sanctuary, protected from the greed of those who would see it strip-mined and hollowed out." The council members shifted, murmuring among themselves. The sheriff slammed his hand onto the table. "It is a lie. The woman is a savage, and the mountain man is a hermit who hides from the law. They are conspiring to steal what is rightfully ours." Thaddeus took a single, heavy step forward. The sound of his boot against the floorboards cracked like a gunshot in the confined space. The sheriff flinched, instinctively reaching for his sidearm. But he stopped when he saw the face of the mountain man. Thaddeus was no longer the silent, stoic protector who kept his distance. His mask of indifference had cracked, revealing a deep, searing intensity that burned with the pain of 20 years. He reached into the heavy, thick wool of his vest and withdrew a small, fragile object. He placed it upon the table, next to the deed. It was the scorched, ancient fragment of weaving he had kept upon his mantle, the very piece he had guarded with his life. "You speak of orders and laws," Thaddeus spoke, his voice deep, gravelly, and unused, tearing through the room like grinding stone. "You speak of who belongs to this land and who does not. But you know nothing of the blood that runs in the soil beneath your feet." He pointed a thick, calloused finger at the pattern on the scorched cloth, and then at the blanket Nahimana had woven. The council members stared at the two items. To their uneducated eyes, The patterns were merely lines and colors. But to anyone who looked closely, the geometric alignment was identical. This weaving, Thaddeus continued, his gaze sweeping across the stunned men, did not belong to a stranger. It belonged to my mother. She was of the same people as the woman you have spent months trying to starve. The room went stiller than a grave. The sheriff's mouth fell open, his face draining of all color. Nahimana turned to look at the giant, her eyes wide with shock and sudden, breathtaking understanding. She looked at his face, really looking at the angular, sharp features she had studied every day, and saw the heritage he had buried under years of solitude and self-imposed exile. "I am not the monster you believe me to be," Thaddeus said, his voice rising, carrying the weight of a man who had finally dropped the burden of a lifetime. "I have lived in the silence of the timberline because I could not bear to see the people who stole my history destroy it further. I have protected her, not because I was her servant, but because she is the last living breath of the only family I have ever known. We are kin in spirit, and kin in the loss of all we held dear." The revelation hung in the air, a physical force. The town council members looked at each other, their faces betraying their confusion and fear. They had believed they were dealing with a random, isolated widow and a dangerous, mindless brute. They were not. They were dealing with a man who possessed a legitimate, ancestral claim to the very geography of their power. Thaddeus was not an outcast, he was a bridge to the past they had tried to erase. Nahimana reached out, her hand finding his large, calloused palm. She laced her slender fingers through his, her touch providing the anchor he had needed to speak his truth. The emotional wall between them had vanished, leaving only a raw, terrifyingly beautiful intimacy. She realized then why he had always understood her language, why he had known the meaning of her patterns without a single word of explanation. They were two halves of a fractured whole, two souls who had carried the same grief across the same mountains, only to find one another in the cold, winter light. "The deed is valid," the judge whispered, his hand hovering over the paper. He looked at the sheriff, then back at the mountain man. The sheriff's face was a mask of impotent rage, but he knew he was defeated. He could not fight the law when the law was staring him in the face, and he certainly could not fight the man who stood before him with the resolve of the entire mountain at his back. "The claim stands," the judge declared, the words ringing out with the finality of a bell. Nahimana exhaled, a sound of profound release that seemed to drain the last of the exhaustion from her body. She looked up at Thaddeus, her dark eyes brimming with a depth of emotion she had never dared to show before. He looked down at her, his expression softened, the jagged, broken parts of his soul finally finding a place to rest. But the silence that followed the judgment was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a town realizing that its foundation had shifted. The council members stared at the pair, their expressions unreadable, caught between the crushing weight of the legal truth and the lingering, poisonous hatred that had festered in the valley for decades. As they turned to leave the chamber, Nahimana felt a strange, cold prickling on the back of her neck. She glanced toward the windows that overlooked the town's square. A group of men had gathered outside, their faces obscured by the coming dusk, their hands resting on the handles of their tools and weapons. They were not cowards, and they were not men who would accept the loss of the land without a final, desperate act of defiance. Thaddeus squeezed her hand, his thumb tracing the delicate line of her wrist. He knew the danger was not over. It had only changed its shape. They had won the war of paper and law, but the war of the heart and the home remained to be settled. What awaited them in the gathering dark of the town square And would they manage to leave the valley together? Or would the final, lingering resentment of the town force them to make the ultimate sacrifice to secure the sanctuary they had fought so hard to reclaim? The tension in the town square was a physical force, a static charge that seemed to make the very air vibrate. The men gathered at the edge of the council building did not move. Their hands remained near their weapons, their eyes narrow and dark with a bitter, simmering resentment. They had come to witness the defeat of the widow and the giant, but they were met with the overwhelming, irrefutable finality of the territorial law. Thaddeus stepped forward, his massive frame shielding Nahimana from the cold, judging eyes of the crowd. He did not look at the men. He looked straight ahead, his gaze fixed upon the distant, snow-dusted slopes of the mountain peak. His presence was not an invitation to violence, but an absolute, undeniable declaration of territorial integrity. He was the sentinel, the guardian, and the master of his own fate. The sheriff, standing on the steps of the council hall, caught the eye of the mountain man. He swallowed hard, his face pale, his hands slowly retreating from the grip of his revolver. The law had spoken. The deed was legal. To challenge them now would be to invite a level of carnage that the valley was entirely unwilling to endure. The sheriff nodded once, a sharp, defeated motion, and retreated into the darkness of his office. The crowd, seeing their leadership crumble, slowly began to disperse. They walked away in silence, their heads bowed, their pride wounded by the sight of two souls who had fought for their truth and emerged entirely unscathed. Nahimana and Thaddeus walked together through the center of the muddy square. They did not rush. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, their hands clasped firmly together. It was a silent, powerful victory march. The mud no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like the earth yielding beneath their feet. They passed the general store, the tavern, and the very spot where her loom had been shattered months prior. The town, once a place of terrifying, exclusionary hostility, now faded into the background of their lives. It was merely a place they had passed through, a chapter that had concluded, leaving them free to return to the only home that had ever truly accepted them. The ascent back to the ridge was different this time. The bitter, biting cold of midwinter had softened, replaced by the faint, promising scent of the coming thaw. Tiny shoots of green began to peek through the retreating snow, and the birds, long silent in the deep freeze, began to sing tentative songs from the high branches of the pines. They reached the cabin as the sun began to dip behind the peaks, painting the sky in vibrant shades of violet and gold. The structure looked different in the twilight. But it was no longer a bleak, lonely fortress against the world. It was a beacon. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney, a sign of the warmth that awaited them within. They stepped across the threshold, and the familiar, comforting scent of cedar and dried herbs enveloped them. Nahimana moved to the hearth, her movements fluid and purposeful. She ignited the fire, the flames licking hungrily at the kindling, and soon the room was filled with the dancing, golden light of the hearth. Thaddeus stood by the heavy door, watching her. He did not move to the shadows. He did not seek the isolation he had once craved. He remained in the light, his massive, broad shoulders relaxed, his sharp eyes following every graceful motion of the weaver. He looked at the room, at the loom standing in the corner, at the blankets hanging upon the wall, and finally, he looked at her. He walked across the room, his stride steady and sure. He stopped behind her as she knelt by the fire, the warmth of the flames casting flickering highlights across her delicate, resilient features. He did not ask her if she was tired. He did not ask her if she was afraid. He reached out, with his large, calloused hands resting gently upon her shoulders. She turned within his embrace, rising to meet him. She looked up, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight, her expression open, unguarded, and filled with a profound, peaceful joy. "We are home," she whispered, her voice a soft, melodic note in the quiet room. Thaddeus nodded, his thumb tracing the line of her cheek, a touch that was a silent promise of a lifetime of protection. He did not need to speak of his love. His love was in the way he had defended her, in the way he had allowed her to heal the fractured parts of his soul, and in the way he stood before her now, a man who had finally learned to accept the grace he had once believed was beyond his reach. "I have spent 20 years waiting for this moment," he murmured, his voice deep and resonant, holding the weight of a lifetime of longing. "I did not know it was you I was waiting for, but I have known the peace of this cabin since the day you crossed the threshold. You have woven a life for us. Na, Himana. A life that belongs to no one but us." She reached up, her fingers grazing the rough, dark beard that framed his jaw. "We have woven it together. Thanager, Dias. The threads of your strength and the threads of my spirit. They are one fabric now. They cannot be pulled apart." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. In the quiet of the mountain sanctuary, surrounded by the vast, indifferent beauty of the high ridge, they stood as one. The silence that had once been a wall between them was now the shared language of a love that had survived the cruelty of the valley and the isolation of the peaks. They moved together toward the hearth, the fire casting their shadows large against the log walls. They were no longer the giant and the widow. They were two broken, resilient souls who had found the only thing that truly mattered, a place to belong, a heart to cherish, and the promise of a future built upon the foundation of their own hard-won truth. The fire burns low in the grate, the scent of wood smoke mingling with the crisp, clean air of the mountain ridge. Our story comes to a quiet close, but the echoes of their journey continue to resonate in the silence of the high timberline. Nahimana and Thaddeus found that the greatest protection is not found in walls or in the strength of arms, but in the courage to let another person into the sanctity of one's own heart. They learned that the past is a heavy burden, but it is not a destination. It is a foundation upon which we build our resilience. By facing the town, by standing for their truth, and by choosing each other, they reclaimed the land, and, more importantly, they reclaimed their own worth. The valley below eventually changed, as all places do, but the mountain remained constant. It stood as a testament to the weaver, who brought color to the gray peaks, and the mountain man, who learned that to protect something beautiful, he did not have to remain in the shadows. He only had to open his arms and step into the light. Love, when it is earned through hardship and tempered by shared struggle, becomes an unbreakable bond. It does not require grand speeches or loud proclamations. It exists in the quiet gestures, the steady hand on the shoulder, the shared meal by the fire, and the silent, profound understanding that one is no longer walking the path alone. They lived their days as they had chosen, within the sovereign peace of their own making. They became a story told by the wind through the pines, a legend of the valley that reminded all who heard it that no matter how deep the winter, and no matter how long the silence, The light of human kindness and the strength of a united spirit will always find a way to thrive, to grow, and to finally, truly, belong. This story is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events or locales is purely coincidental. The themes of historical struggle and resilience are intended for narrative purposes and do not reflect specific historical records or political commentary. Please enjoy this tale as a piece of creative storytelling meant for entertainment and emotional reflection.